All right. Welcome. um, so um, I haven't done a video in a very long time. But yeah, there's been a lot of questions on my mind. So this is going to be interesting to kind of I haven't done a video in a long time. So working through these questions is going to be interesting. Uh, Doing this in I guess real time. But anyways, yeah. So let's begin. Um, I'm gonna trace this trajectory. What's up, Sam? I'm gonna trace this trajectory back to when I started reading philosophy, because I think the question of origin is always a difficult one because the origin doesn't exist, right? But you, as a person, eventually decided to pick up reading philosophy at one point, and you have to, I guess, reinvigorate or kind of reflect on what made you go there, right? What made you want to pursue it? So it's a question of if you want to say intention or you want to say motive. It's a question of that. Um, and when I first read philosophy or started reading philosophy seriously, is when I was getting serious into religion. Um, but in a kind of unfortunate and also grateful way, um, I kind of put religion on the back end and discovered that I really liked reading philosophy. And I would say that has occupied me for a couple of years now. Um, but I would say I think reading Julie Resch kind of reached its pinnacle with my disillusionment with philosophy. Um, of course, Julie wasn't the one that nailed it in the coffin for me, but she was definitely the kind of cherry on top kind of thing. I think it was something that I was feeling for a while, and I noticed I was, just sort of getting angry, frustrated, and a little bit disappointed in some philosophical group settings, and the way I was looking at philosophy was no longer what I imagined it to be. Um, of course, I never had like a formal mentor or something, but that's always weird to say, like, I need a philosophy teacher to teach me the proper way of philosophy. Philosophy is always such a weird um, space to argue for this, to argue to have a mentor, to argue to not have a mentor. um, Generally, I don't like the overt dependency that is created when one decides to look at somebody as a mentor for philosophy. If there's anything, the mentor should just be like, yeah, I don't know shit. um, so you do you. But um, I never cared about rigor and discipline that much anyway. So let's, it's, if people want to do that kind of stuff, I was never interested. So yes, in some sense, I was lost in my attempt to read philosophy. But over the course of the years, I've noticed a couple of books that I've reread and a couple of books that I never finished and I never cared about. And I had a hard time finishing. So I bring up this question because not only before I began my my disillusionment, so when I began reading philosophy, I had already kind of had a sort of disillusionment with religion. Even though I think the last religion that I was a part of was Islam, um, that was a sort of last pinnacle for me. And then after deployment, and it ironically has nothing to do with deployment. I mean, it does and it doesn't. Um, but I sort of dropped Islam not too long afterwards once I got home. But anyways, um, so yes, I was in a period of disillusionment with religion, and then philosophy. My ambition for philosophy grew more. Um, but what I started to notice was that I'm in an age where there's so much information. There's literally so much secondary and tertiary sources about philosophers and thinkers that you could spend literally the rest of your life, if you want to, reading one thinker, right? Because here's the thing, right? You could read Plato over and over again. There's plenty of stuff to read on Plato, trust me. And then on top of that, there's plenty of secondary and tertiary sources about Plato that attempt to expand, elaborate, reread, reinvent, um, you know, or maybe even negate Plato, for you to explore and try to get a kind of understanding of Plato as such. Um, and the same thing with probably a lot of thinkers, really, a lot of major Western kind of philosophy thinkers like Hegel and Spinoza and Kant and just so much out there, that it can make you feel a little bit lost, when attempting to pursue any thinker, because there's always this question of, did I read enough of this thinker to understand him? Well, the question that the answer that I'm going to give is no. There's never a point in time that's going to be satisfactory enough for you to say that I understand this thinker to the fullest extent. Um, the only advantage that you would have is time, that you've just spent a lot of time reading Kant or Hegel or Plato or whatever, just like I've spent a lot of time rereading only the first of Buber's work, well, technically the second, of Ayan Dao, right? I've read some pieces here and there of like his other works, but I've spent a lot of time. Probably I've read that book at least 4 times, on the Ayan Dao, and just carefully looked over it and glazed over it. Um, but that has kind of left me. But again, once I pay attention to the books that I've actually reread, what are the books that I've actually reread a couple of times? And I'll just share them with you, if I can remember them. The books that I have reread are Buber's Ayan Dao, which is inherently it's kind of like theological philosophy, right? It's kind of theology slash philosophy in a way. But I would call it like kind of like secular theology, because Buber is trying to make the profane sacred. Um, and then there's Muhammad Iqbal's book called The Reconstruction of Islam, which I've also read at least 3 times. Um, I've forgotten most of it again, but I've read it a good, again, 3 times. And that is also a theological kind of philosophical, important work, for Islam, which I also really loved at the time. That was actually the first book that got me into kind of philosophy. Um, and then I have read at least Julie Resch's book, at least I think twice. So this is this is an interesting one, because it's not necessarily theological, but it actually points to my sort of disillusionment with philosophy again. Um, and so, I know I've read like other works that I can't remember right now if I've repeated or not, but again, a lot of them I kind of seem to have like kind of dropped along the way. Um, oh, the other one, actually, the other book that I did read twice was by Iris Murdoch. I think it was called like um, it was like an ethical book. It was about the good. It was a Plato related book, but it was in some sense a little bit theologically minded, because it was about virtue and everything else. Um, even though she's not necessarily a Christian or anything. She probably considers herself an atheist, but her advocation for the good was that the good is for nothing, and it was a kind of calling to do the good for nothing. So you can kind of have some or find some Christian sentiment in that. But I read that book. I read that book twice actually, and I really enjoyed it. Um, so what I've noticed is that for me, there's certain elements in books that either kind of propel me towards a disillusionment of something, right? Um, I feel like Iqbal's first book kind of propelled me into a disillusionment of philosophy. I mean, disillusionment of religion, because of his challenge to reinvent or reconstruct Islam. And then Julie is another period where I had to, um, challenge myself to, become disillusioned with philosophy. So now that I am disillusioned, where do I go? That's the question to ask. What do I read? It's funny because I started reading recently. I'm in Dawood's book club, where we have been reading the Post-Structuralist Thinkers. It's like a book by, I think, James Williams, where he sort of introduces to you the post-structuralist thinkers like Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Deleuze. And I was really liking them, really liking the introductions, but and to the point it got me to pick up Derrida's Of Grammatology again. And I was surprised it wasn't as difficult as I thought it was to read it, but I noticed immediately that I started to become disinterested in why I care about understanding the primacy of writing over speech. At least that is Derrida's sort of main argument in the book. So this was a difficult question because there's a lot of things, and also I've started reading like some of Schopenhauer too through like an audiobook, so it's not really reading but listening. I started noticing that most philosophy books seem to interest me, but they're not interesting enough. And it's that question of why is it not interesting enough? And is it a question of your discipline? Is it a question of my motive? Is it a question of my, um, just being lazy, right? Going back to discipline again. Is it a question of just being lazy? Why can I not dedicate myself to finish some of these books? And yet there's some books that I have that I've read them, and I've had little resistance reading them. Um, and I don't consider them any less difficult than the ones that I am currently pursuing. So this question I have to consider because I think it is easy to get caught up in the kind of enthusiasm of what everybody else is reading. For example, I'm in plenty of groups that read Hegel and Lacan and Zizek. That's probably like the main three. That seems to be the sort of mini culture online. Of course, I'm pretty sure there's groups that are dedicated to Plato, which I did find one at one time, which is how I encountered Iris Murdoch. Um, but yeah, there's this sort of cultural kind of attraction right now, online cultural attraction, and I know there's online groups that are very dedicated to like Deleuze or like Marx. Um, those again very popular thinkers. But the question is, do you need those thinkers for yourself? A lot of people kind of give like a sort of objective argument for why they read, or at least they try to portray like a kind of objective argument for why they read certain thinkers. Like, I read Hegel because obviously Hegel, in their opinion, gives a better understanding of the culture today, right? Or if you counter somebody that read Marx, they'll be like, yeah, well, you need to read Marx so you can understand the capitalist dilemma that we have today. And the same thing with literally probably almost every thinker that people read. They can argue for why it is worth reading why they're worth reading. Okay, well, if this is the status quo, then we have to understand that, well, every thinker is worth reading, which makes it a point of I only have so much life in my life, so much life to give, so much time to spend, um, that I can't possibly dedicate myself to all the thinkers that are worth reading if, in fact, all of them contribute something to the history of philosophy. So then you're left with a dilemma here. You're left with a dilemma. If everybody is worth reading, then where do I stand in this point? Um, and what I've noticed about certain thinkers is that certain thinkers like Zizek and many others, many contemporary thinkers, many contemporary thinkers are kind of like a combination of thinkers. Like, Zizek, we just know that he's a combination of like Lacan, Hegel, um, Kierkegaard. Like he has some other like little bit of other thinkers that he likes to follow, but for the most part, he's a big reader of Zizek. I mean, of Lacan and Hegel. So that seems to construct Zizek as a thinker, where he's coming from. Um, and I think this question for myself is, I guess maybe the better question to propose to yourself with this question of reading is, where do I want to come from? Um, for a while, I was so cynical about people that had their obsessions with certain thinkers, because fundamentally it annoyed me. So I tried to counteract that with my own obsessions with other thinkers. But Buber, yeah, Buber, I was definitely obsessed with. And Julie Resch, I was obsessed with for a while too. But I think her thinking gave me an avenue, a kind of way out. And the same thing with Sharon. Sharon gave me a way out of my dilemma. And my dilemma is, well, I think Julie kind of set the framework, and then I think Sharon kind of set the pathway for my way out. So Julie, of course, reading Julie, I succumbed to futility and negativity. Um, but Julie is an interesting thinker because for her it's kind of like an either or, like you're doomed either way you go, right? Um, and Sharon is a thinker of, in my opinion, of boredom and exhaustion. So I feel like the moment that I started to understand Julie's work a little bit better, that she wasn't necessarily, I mean, she will call positivity illusions, but also at the same time, her philosophy is not a method or practice that you can actually do because it's fundamentally about nothing. It's about failure and failing. Um, so it's not something that you can actively practice. It's not like a prescription of what to do. It's not a prescription to be negative, to live negatively. She's simply describing her opinion, the world as it is, and her critique about positive psychology. So there is no way or no method in Julie's work to follow and to go about. But once I accepted that framework, it became very easy to take Emil Sharon and his advocacy for exhaustion. What's so important about his philosophy of exhaustion? Well, his importance about philosophy of exhaustion is that only when you've become exhausted, only when you've finally exhausted something, can you finally go on to something else, basically. And I think it has raised a powerful question in my mind, because I think what it is that I started realizing that my cynicism about people doing philosophy and the way they do philosophy, because I felt it was very ego related, and I'm pretty sure it is. But if it's ego related, it makes doing philosophy a little bit impossible, because you can always have that cynical voice of just like they're just, you know, hearing their own voices when they talk, basically, or that's all they really care about. Um, and they, they're so pompous and arrogant about what they think the solution should be to solve the current paradigms of our times, or to solve the current issues of our times. Again, there's always a cynical voice that can be reflected back to the thinker or to the person that is giving you a philosophical problem or solution to a problem. And what I've noticed is because there is no end to that cynicism, I think I have exhausted that cynicism for myself. I'm tired of being cynical because you can always be cynical. There's never a point in which it cannot, right? It can always be a matter of selfishness, egotisticalness, um, bad motive, bad intention. It can always be that. You can always look and read people as that. Um, and so I just no longer, I put it like this. I actually put it more negative in a Julie terms. I said, okay, fine. Everybody has bad intentions and everybody's egoic when they're talking about their philosophy. Fine. But you see, that leaves me with nothing to really deal with. Leaves me with nothing to grapple with or to think with because everything is just egoic and um, cynical. Uh, so Sharon helped me as a way out of taking this exhaustion seriously. Um, but once I started thinking about exhaustion, I realized that I'm not exhausted by God yet. There's still a lot of work to do. I realized that, I kind of took a detour um, a little bit because I think my initial pursuit was with God from the beginning. But I think it got a little bit sidetracked because I was so concerned about, what was the right religion. And then I realized, like, okay, there is no right religion in a kind of objective sense for me. Typically, I despise any understanding of religion in terms of, well, this is a religion that provides something that others don't provide. Now, maybe we can give a distinction where by saying that it doesn't necessarily say that that religion is better than other religions, right? But maybe there is certain religions that perhaps can answer in a better way given the context of the problem. But again, I'm definitely always hesitant about that because that sort of has a kind of reduction about the other that, is saying that this religion does not provide. Um, and of course, there's several things that are problematic with making such comparisons and in a kind of hierarchy of religions because, well, it's kind of like the same dilemma with trying to understand a thinker. It's like, well, do you really understand the thinker? It's like, yes, well, I've read the thinker. It's like, yes, but have you read every expansion of that thinker, every commentary on that thinker, every rethinking about that thinker? And most people probably haven't. And the same thing goes with every religion that's out there. When people talk about just Buddhism, it's not just Buddhism, it's Buddhisms and all the different types that sort of have challenged each other and their own gripes with each other. And the same thing with Christianity and its sort of pluralistic denominations and all their gripes with each other. And Islam has the same thing. And literally every religion has the same dilemma of this increasing pluralistic denomination or branches that sort of root from them with increasingly not just primary text, but also increasing secondary, tertiary commentary about their own denomination and branches that continues to expand, that continues to try to respond to the modern status quo. So again, when we try to say that a religion is better than the other, this is the problem that we run into. It's a problem of the sort of inescapable quantifying of knowledge that we can't escape. Um, so it always feels like an inadequate assessment when we say a specific religion is better than the other, in my opinion, because I mean who you going to argue with this? You're going to talk to a Vedanta Buddhist first, or you're going to want to talk to a Sufi mystic for Islam first, or are you going to talk to a Sunni Muslim or a Shia Muslim, or are you going to talk to a Druze Muslim, or are you going to talk to, there's so much different expansions to understand this hierarchy of what you're proposing. So to me, I think it's fruitless to even go into that area of conversation to say which religion is necessarily better. Of course, I understand that people want to, um, protect or the differences between religions. That's fine. But I think if we're respecting the differences between religion, then we understand that it's not a sort of hierarchy or a better placement. It's just that they're just different. It's not a vertical plane. It's a horizontal plane. It's just pure difference between them. So it becomes difficult to assess, in my opinion, what is the better quote. But of course, there can be, in my opinion, maybe contextual, like, this was the kind of Buddhism that was practiced at the time that posed certain issues. And the question that you have to ask yourself, are there people certainly rethinking those issues? I can probably bet that there are. And the question is, are you engaging with that? And do you have the time to engage with that? And would you bother engaging with that? That's another question. But I'm taking a sidetrack from all of this. Anyways, just like philosophy and religion, there's always just a abundant amount of information to deal with. But as I am pointing out, the topic itself can never be exhausted, which makes it hard to make claims, and yet somehow we have to still make claims and risks and decisions and distinctions. Um, but I am not necessarily interested in all of that. I am not interested, and this is something that took me a couple of years to understand, is that I'm not interested as a thinker to provide the world with a coherent or better explanation for how they can live. If people want to do that, even though I'm cynically opposed to them, because I feel like it's quite egotistical, um, but again, because I'm trying to get over my cynicism, I sort of resort to Sharon's indifference here, where I don't really care if that's what they want to do. That's what they want to do. They can do it. Um, and it doesn't necessarily have to be reduced to a kind of egotistical motive. But I'm just saying that is kind of my hesitancy and my leniency when I look at that and when I read the sort of proposition of, you know, explaining and sort of diagnosing the world and its problems, and then saying, this is my solution. This is the sort of assumptions that have gone wrong. And if only people sort of undo these assumptions, then society would improve and grow better. And this is the sort of danger in society. Again, as much as I like to entertain these thoughts, um, for my own life, I'm not an advocate of becoming a thinker that gives prescriptions or diagnoses to problems in society. I'm just not interested in that. Even though, ironically, I'm going to be pursuing a PhD in sociology, but I'm just not interested in actually doing that seriously in terms of giving a diagnosis to people for this. Because I think the problem for me, or the slight trick, or the slight a jokester trick for me, is that when I give a description of the world, is simply a kind of like reflection of myself, the way that I piece together my experiences with the piecing of the thinkers that I've read. And so the world transforms itself, and I transform myself in a sort of mutual reciprocation as I read and think and look at the world and read again, certain thinkers that I think. So the fact that I pick certain thinkers as my background transfigures my world, and brings it forth into the foreground. Um, and it's a constant mutual reciprocation, where even the society itself brings me to the foreground for the thinkers that I decide to pursue um, in this scenario, or the disposition of myself. But anyways, the point is, because I'm not interested in giving a formal, objective kind of description of the world, and diagnosing problems for people, and giving solutions, um, you're left with an open-ended question. What do I then do with philosophy, and what then is the purpose and necessity of my reading of philosophy? Um, because I don't necessarily consider myself super smart to give um, a metaphysics or a whole system of thought, um, the best that I can do, just probably like any normal any normal average person can do, is just simply try to piece their reality together from their own terms, um, piece the reality together from their own language, um, and their own thinking. Because I think there is something beautiful about coming to a similar realization of a great thinker like Kant or Plato or Hegel, um, because it means that you've done some of the thinking yourself to understand their conclusions. Um, but if we only read thinkers and we only sort of echo thinkers, then we risk never really piecing together our worldview from our own, you know, our own tools, our own abilities, to our own abilities. And yes, our own abilities will be fundamentally inadequate because, again, these thinkers are not great for no reason. They're great because they literally changed the course of history and the way we understand the world. Um, but if you're like me, who don't really consider myself to be one that's going to change the world or be a thinker that everybody will respond to, um, then you understand what is your task. And the question is that you still have a task as a sort of average, mediocre philosopher. Um, but your task is to piece your own world together, because obviously, um, the there's a couple of options that is not going to work for you. For example, the status quo of reality will not work for you because you've already begun to question it. Um, but then also mimicking and following into these great thinkers' footsteps is not going to work for you because you're not as great and you're not as, intellectually refined, and so on. So what then is your task? And because you cannot go back to the status quo, and you can't also be this thinker, you're tasked with becoming something for yourself, bringing forth something for yourself. And so the way I have gone about it is that my own life is my own philosophical problem. My own life is the biggest philosophical problem that I have. Um, so again, I think that's what I started understanding, is that I need to read thinkers that I can connect some kind of use them, play with them as some type of, I guess, like tools to piece together a worldview for my life. And so I think the question of God is what apparently I need after giving it much thought. It seems like I have not exhausted the question of God, and I think this is why I am pursuing it again, because I have not exhausted it, and I have not found, and I hate saying find because find is not a good um, thing. But I would say this, instead of find, I would say this. I have not pieced together my own coherence, my own worldview about God. I think that's probably the best way to frame it, rather than find, because finding suggests finding the answer from a specific thinker. I don't think I'm going to get the answer from a specific thinker, but what they can give me is a worldview from which I can put that as my own, as bring that as a part of my repertoire create to create my own worldview concerning God. Um, And so this is what I need. This is what I need. So um, that's why I'm pursuing now. Was it the book Monstrosity of Christ by Zizek, and then John Milbank is a contributor to, which I am currently very much enjoying. I'm actually enjoying. I mean, I'm enjoying both of them, reading both of them. But John Milbank is a very fascinating figure to me because I guess he kind of started the whole radical Orthodox movement, which has made me interested in reading more of his work and the people that are also involved in that movement, like Catherine Pickstock and Graham Ward. Um, it seems like there's a lot of thinkers in that movement to um, reconsider. Um, what I found very fascinating, actually, from John Milbank is that he seems to give like a very fascinating historical picture of just like we don't have to. He's like basically saying like we don't have to accept Kant. By the way, we don't have to accept Kant as the person to respond to, which most of you have done. Um, which is fascinating because it once you basically dismiss Kant as somebody worth responding to, um, or maybe put it this way, not responding to, but building up from. Once you dismiss Kant as someone that's worth building up from, you get a different course of history. You get a different trajectory, um, which seems to be some of the radical orthodoxy's kind of point, where it's like they think Kant really fucked up when he separated revelation and reason, um, and he proposed this sort of, oh well, reason has limits, which is funny because then it becomes strictly epistemological, um, and as Milbeck sort of argues, well, you know, some of these older thinkers didn't like, what's his name, Cruza and Augustine and some other thinkers didn't necessarily take reason and revelation separately, whereas Kant does, and then you get this dilemma of the noumena and the phenomena, whatever, the phenomenal and the noumena. So and then people think that's worth building up from or responding to, and so that builds a course of history. And John Milbanks, rejects this. He's like, well, there's other thinkers that were sort of underground that were already contesting Kant and giving a different um, avenue to this progress of thought. Um, Typically, he kind of reduces this to like the Catholic historical timeline and the Protestant historical timeline, which for him, Kant sort of feeds that Protestant historical timeline because then Hegel responds to Kant, and we all know Hegel is basically a Lutheran, and so that feeds a kind of trajectory of thought. Um, which he says, John Milbank in Monstrosity of Christ basically says, no wonder that basically Zizek comes to a position of sort of Christian atheism. He says, Milbank basically says, yeah, because atheism, once we started responding to Kant and some of the others along that pathway, it was especially some of the Enlightenment thinkers, because it's no wonder that we get to a kind of secularism and atheism in the end. Um, so it's a very interesting argument, even though I don't necessarily like the reduction, but I do like entertaining that kind of narrative because it really just kind of shows. I mean, I would say this instead of looking at it like a reduction, I would read Milbank's response as there's a different trajectory of history that you can take that you don't have to accept. And that can give you a different interpretation of history, a different interpretation of Christianity, which he has come up with radical orthodoxy instead. So it's a it's very fascinating, Milbank and Zizek's response. The book itself is about paradox versus dialectic. Some of Milbank's response to Zizek concerning Hegel is very fascinating because he shares some of the gripes that I initially had with hearing about Hegel and how people sort of depict Hegel. Because if we're talking about contradiction, how do you have to pick the antagonism, which is actually Milbank's argument that there's a plurality of antagonisms, a plurality of opposites from which you can pick from. So how do you know which opposite do you pick from to put in the dialectic responsibly, basically? Which is, you could say, a kind of postmodern critique as well, because there's sort of like there's just difference, so much opposites to play with. So yeah, that's just my main task right now that I'm exploring, which is attempting to exhaust God, attempting to create a worldview where I exhaust God. Can I exhaust God? That's another question to myself. Will I revert to a kind of ambivalence about God? That's a question for me, in the future. But right now, it seems to be this is where my position is. And I think I'm having a better time reading now, and feeling less disgusted now that I'm reading more about God and sort of just like theological issues, theological understandings of the world that I don't really quite remember reading before. And some of these responses are quite new and contemporary, so that's also exciting. But it seems like there's much for me to explore here. And it does seem to be like this is the trajectory of history that I need to go through. Um, Whereas I totally envy those that can just, read philosophy and then that's really all they need, right? I sort of envy that. Um, so to me, it's a kind of unfortunate need that I must go through. Unfortunate, uh, necessary reading that I must do. And I think I've needed that. I've needed a kind of necessity for a while now. I needed a kind of calling to read something rather than just reading out of whim. Because I have been reading at a whim, but my whim has, ironically hit some darts, hit some bullseyes. And after hitting some bullseyes, I started realizing like, oh, there's a kind of trend in my reading habits that, kind of point to like, why is it that I read Buber enthusiastically? Why do I read certain thinkers enthusiastically rather than not? So there seems to already be like a sort of motive force that is driving me a certain direction, and I've been opposing it without really realizing it. But anyways, it was nice talking to you guys. Thank you, Sam, for being here. I like your comments here. Um, you said you like to go nowhere and everywhere, over and under and between the spaces of words and rules and tones. Sounds very Nietzschean, by the way. Sort of over and under of the overman. But yeah, other than that, I have nothing else to add. So you guys take care. All right. Bye.